Okay, this next section is we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into key components of the endocannabinoid system. After you've watched this lecture, you should be able to describe what the endocannabinoid system is, understand generally the functions of it, and then key components of the endocannabinoid system and how that kind of plays out in the body. So there's a lot of kind of medical technical terms in this lecture. So we've provided you with a glossary at the beginning of this slide. So you can always go back and reference these if you don't quite understand some of these new terms that you may just be getting introduced to as well. Don't worry too much about, understanding all the intricate details of the physiology of this. This will just give you a really good understanding of sort of how the endocannabinoid system works. And you can always refer back to some of these glossary terms if you need to. Okay. So we now know that the endocannabinoid system is a major regulatory system in the body. What does that actually mean? Well, let's look at a few quotes from some of the people who have been discovering this or working with the endocannabinoid system over the last few decades. So this is Ethan Russo. We've talked about him in the past. He's a fantastic lecturer, he's very open with the research that he's doing, and his take on what the endocannabinoid system is in a very basic and simple definition is what keeps the rest of how we function in balance. So it's kind of like that master switch. If there's too much activity in a system, the endocannabinoid system just tends to bring it down to a normal level. And on the other hand, if there's an overactive system or something happening too much in there, it increases it back to a normal level. So that's a really basic understanding of it. And so it's a regular system. A regulatory system, and helps to kind of manage that equilibrium that our body is always doing for us. So here's another way to describe it. The endocannabinoid system has direct biological effects due to modulation of other neurotransmitter systems. So you can see we're getting a pattern here, is that the endocannabinoid system itself may be controlling a lot of our neurotransmitter activity that happens in the body. Now, a neurotransmitter activity is just when it happens automatically for us. So if we were to really slow it down, we could say I want to raise my hand right now. And so there would be a signal from my brain to the muscles in my hand or in my arm that says, okay, raise that arm up right now. And then when I want to lower it down, there would be another signal that goes from my brain to those muscles in my arm and says, okay, lower that down right now. Now, of course, this all happens kind of behind the scenes. We're not consciously aware of ourselves telling our muscles to do things that we want it to do. But those are what neurotransmitters do. They happen very quickly. They're created. Sometimes those chemicals that are created may only last nanoseconds. Other times they might linger for minutes or hours in the body. But those are those signals that are constantly happening between our brain and our muscles and our blood system and our ability to breathe. Those are constantly happening within the body. So widespread neuromodulatory system that plays important roles in the central nervous system, that's abbreviated CNS, central nervous system, the central nervous system development, the synaptic plasticity, so that synapses are the areas of our neurons that kind of send those neurotransmitter signals back and forth. They're electrical signals that go back and forth. And then how our body responds to the endogenous, what's happening inside our body, as well as our environmental results. So we know that we're affected not only by what's going on in the outside world, where our physiology is affected by that, but we're also affected by what's happening on the inside world. So what's happening within our body, because our body is in constant activity. It's always making things, destroying things. If we get on some stress from the external world, we see something that is stressful to us, that's going to cause some changes within the body that will create stress hormones and cause us to go into a certain state, both emotional and physical state. So it's all quite complex, and it's all quite mysterious, and it's all quite amazingly fantastic that all of this is happening without our knowledge or conscious control. So the endogenous cannabinoid system, of course named for the plant that led to its discovery, is one of the most important physiological systems in establishing and maintaining human health. So again, we're seeing these researchers are talking about how it's really kind of a master controller of our physiology. How did we miss this for a few hundred years, right? It's super interesting. Endocannabinoids and the receptors are found throughout the body. So we find these receptors in the brain, in the organs, in the connective tissue, in our immune cells, in our skin. So we have these receptors everywhere. So they must be important, right? With its complex actions in our immune system, our nervous system, and virtually all the body's organs, the endocannabinoids are literally a bridge between the body and the mind. So again, those neurotransmitters that I'm talking about, that's not just happening on a physiological level, that's also happening on a mental and emotional level as well. And some may even say we're starting to get into the realm of spiritual when we're looking at the endocannabinoid system. So really, it encompasses all of who we are and possibly even consciousness. So we won't go down that rabbit hole right now, but it's kind of fun to think about how one system that got overlooked for so long is such a big part of our health and well-being. So, and this Bradley Elger goes on to say, by understanding the system, we begin to see a mechanism that could connect brain activity and states of physical health and disease. Well, I think a lot of us just intuitively know that there is a connection between our brain health, our mental and emotional health, and our spiritual health, as well as our physical health. There's a direct connection in there. And so the endocannabinoid system just might be that connection that helps us to unlock some of what's going on within our body and who we are and how we sort of live our lives. Okay, so functions of the endocannabinoid system. We already talked about how it's involved in all of human physiology, but let's look at some of the key areas where the researchers are starting to look at. So memory and learning, decision making, reward perception, our emotions. You can see all of those are part of kind of intangible parts of who we are, and they are quite important for some of our emotional and mental well-being. Then we get into more physical areas of our health, like digestion, motor function, our immune response, inflammation, which is part of our immune system, our appetite, our pain, or our perception of pain, blood pressure, bone growth, connective tissue health, and nerve protectant. So how is our nervous system being protected? So you can see a wide range of areas where the researchers are really starting to dive into and saying, how is this all connected? What does this all mean? So we have three key components of the endocannabinoid system, and this complex system that we've just kind of given an introduction to, actually right now there's kind of only three areas where that are its structure, if you will, within the body. So we have the cannabinoid receptors themselves, and then we have the endocannabinoids. So these are recognized by and interact with those receptors. So that's kind of that lock and key mechanism that we talk about also in our hormone system or anything else that kind of triggers a reaction in the body. So we can think of the cannabinoid receptors as the lock and the endocannabinoids as the key that goes inside that lock and then opens up some activity or triggers some activity to happen. So it's that lock and key system in the same way that a lot of our hormones work as well. And then we have the enzymes. So the enzymes that will either create or degrade these chemicals within the body, and they usually happen on demand. Now, that is not under our conscious control, at least not that anyone is aware of at this point or anyone can control at this point. But it's the body just knows, hey, we need more anandamide here, we need more 2-AG here. Just in the same way the body says, hey, we need more of this hormone or that hormone. So it's the same, it functions in the same physiological way. It's just a different receptors and it's different triggers or chemical components that trigger those receptors that are happening within the endocannabinoid system. So let's look at the receptors. These cannabinoid receptors are a class of membrane receptors. So membrane receptors are things that happen on the membrane of the cell. So if you remember from way back in biology, the actual cell itself is made up of a lipid bilayer. So you have basically a skin around every single cell in our body, and that skin is porous in some ways, and it has these kind of locking mechanisms within it, and that's how we get things in and out of the cell. So a lot of our physiological action in the body that keeps us alive and healthy actually happens within every individual cell in the body. And we have trillions of cells in our body, and those cells are always dying, and then new ones are being created. So it's quite intricate, but these receptors will sit on that outside lipid bilayer of certain cells, and there's higher concentrations in some parts of the body than in other parts of the body. So this is a class of cell membrane receptors, which are part of the family of the G protein coupled receptors. Now, you don't really need to understand all of how that happens. Just know that the G protein coupled receptors are actually the most abundant receptors within the human body. So they're not just used for the endocannabinoid system. They can be used for a lot of different other things. So it's like it's a model that works, and so the body has kind of recreated that model for several of our physiological systems in the body. So we talked about the two endocannabinoid receptor 1 and endocannabinoid receptor 2. There's actually several endocannabinoid receptors that have actually been understood in the body or created within the body, or that the body creates itself. We've identified a few of them, but most of the research that has been done is just focusing on CB1 and CB2, those two first receptors that are most abundant in the body and that they were the first discovered. I'm sure as time goes on, we're going to start to understand that there's a lot of variances in the CB1 and CB2 receptors that may do slightly different processes within the body, might have kind of specialty receptors for the endocannabinoid system. But right now we're just kind of focusing on CB1 and CB2 because that's what's been studied the most. The structure is very similar. You can see in this diagram here, it kind of goes in and out of the cell in kind of a jaggedy manner. But the differences between CB1 and CB2 isn't so much in their structure, but it's where they are within the body. So what organs are they on? When we see a lot of receptors clustered onto a certain organ or a certain area of the body, then we know that whatever's going to trigger those receptors is going to have a really profound or important effect in that area of the body. So if we have a lot of these receptors within the brain, we know that anything that triggers those receptors within the brain is going to really influence how the brain works or how the brain responds to different activities going on both internally and externally in the body. And here's just another look, probably a little more realistic look of what those receptors look like. Again, just an animation that kind of shows you can see that lipid bilayer, which is those two sort of squiggly looking things with the ball on the end and then the legs kind of coming together. That's the like the skin of the cell, and you can see it isn't completely closed. We can get things in and out of it. You can kind of think of the cells as really tiny miniature skin, and we know that when we put something on our skin, it gets absorbed into our body, gets into the bloodstream. So we can get things through our skin, but it does provide a good structure and protective layer because it is a little bit more, not a little bit, but it is quite important how it allows things in and out of the cell. So we've talked about how we can find these CB1 and CB2 receptors are found in all areas of the body. But the majority of these receptors are in different areas. So we have the majority of our CB1 receptors are primarily distributed throughout the central nervous system. So the central nervous system in this diagram shows those green dots that are there. And again, this is just a representation, but the central nervous system really is all about our brain and our spinal cord and all of the nerve endings that come off of that, which there's a lot of them. There's some major nerves that come off the spinal cord, and then all of those kind of branch out quite a bit. Our CB2 receptors are primarily located on the organs of immunity. So most of our organs in the body have some sort of role in keeping us healthy, keeping out the invaders, fixing things that go wrong, repairing damage in the body. So we find those on our organs of immunity. And the CB1 receptors are more in the central nervous system, so they kind of more relate to some of our senses that we rely upon to also keep us healthy and interact. So things like appetite, stress management, how we sleep, our memory, how our memories are stored, how we perceive pain, those kinds of things. So again, these cannabinoid receptors are quite similar in their structure, but what makes them different is where they are within the body, and then depending on where they are, that will determine what function that they have within the body. So this is just another way of representing kind of the concentration of receptors within the body. You can see within the brain we have a lot of those CB1 receptors because the brain is really involved in our senses, right? That's where our memories are stored, and we need our brain to be able to close down and shut down and go to sleep so that we're able to sleep and rest. Our stress response kind of gets triggered through the brain. And then we see the CB2 receptors are more in our immunity, so our lymphatics, some of those organs of immunity. We'll look at that in a little more detail. And then you can see in the blue here is where we have a kind of an equal concentration of both CB1 and CB2 receptors. And again, the major organs there are the liver and the pancreas, and then some in the brain as well. So you can see where we have these clusters of receptors, we can kind of start to understand, it's like, hey, there's something important going on within this area of the body. So the cannabinoid receptors are influenced by varying degrees by the endocannabinoids, but we also have learned that we can use cannabinoids that aren't created by the body, so cannabinoids from plants, such as the cannabis plant, or cannabinoids that have been created in the lab, so synthetic cannabinoids. We can supplement with those in order to kind of make up for some deficiencies if our own endocannabinoid system isn't doing a good job. So let's look at a little bit more detail about the location of the CB1 receptors. So we talked about CB1 is mostly concerned or concentrated in our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord. But we also find an abundance of CB1 receptors within our reproductive system, both within male and female reproductive systems, so the testes and the uterus, Also in our endocrine glands. So our endocrine glands are really important for our not only our reproductive, but just keeping us warm or cold, right? That temperature regulation, our blood sugar levels, those kinds of things. So it's kind of the day-to-day operation within the body. So within the endocrine glands, we see a high concentration. So that would include the pineal gland, the pituitary gland. Those are both, of course, in the brain. Our pancreas, which is responsible for creating insulin, and that's how we manage blood sugar levels when we eat or when we fast. Pancreas, the ovaries, testes again, thyroid, parathyroid, hypothalamus, and the adrenal glands. So a lot of those organs really have high clusters of cannabinoid receptors. We also find them in high concentration of CB1 receptors in our leukocytes, which are part of our immune system, in our spleen, in our heart, in our GI tract, so gastrointestinal tract, which is all part of our digestion. Digestion is super important to life because that's how we get nutrients into the body. Our liver, the adipose tissue, which is just our fat cells, and our connective tissue, which includes not just our bones and sinew, but our blood, lymphatics, those kinds of things that are happening. So again, a little diagram of distribution of the CB1 receptors within the brain, and you can see the different areas of the brain are really important for different functioning. So in our cerebral cortex, that's an area of decision making, cognitive and emotional behavior. We have the caudate nucleus, which is really important for learning and memory. The putamen, that's regulates our movements and influences various types of learning as well. So for people who have had a stroke or had an accident where they've lost some functioning, maybe they can't walk and they have to relearn how to walk or relearn how to talk because of some brain damage that has happened, and that's happening in that area of the brain. We have places where they regulate voluntary movements, responsible for anxiety and stress. The hypothalamus, really important for regulating our body temperature, so we always kind of keep that homeostasis. Our body stays within the couple of degrees at any given time, no matter whether it's really cold outside or really hot outside. Of feeding, so how not only are we hungry or not hungry, but what stimulates our appetite, how our digestive system works. Hippocampus, again, memory and learning. We have another place, substantia nigra, that's important for, has an important role in our reward center, how we feel satisfaction, as well as that ties into addiction or addictive behavior. And there's definitely some movement or something that regulates how we move within the world as well. And then the cerebellum is also part of our motor control and our ability to be coordinated, so that understanding of where your body is in space and time that allows you to catch a ball or walk downstairs, those kinds of things. Just one thing of important note is there is a low concentration of CB1 and CB2 or any endocannabinoid receptors within the brainstem. This is why no one has ever directly died of cannabis ingestion, because it doesn't matter how much cannabis you take of the natural plant, your breathing will never stop, and you will never, your heart will never stop. So this is what we see with some drugs, is they actually hit targets in that brain cell, or they hit receptors in that brain cell that could eventually get overwhelmed and shut down breathing, or shut down the body's ability to, the heart to beat or the body to breathe. So high doses of cannabis are not going to stop your breathing, not going to stop your heart. This makes cannabis an exceedingly safe drug that we can use to help with a whole lot of different health systems as well, without worrying about death from overdose. Okay, CB2 receptors, as we talked about earlier, we primarily find those in the immune system, or the organs of the immune system. So our monocytes, our macrophages, our B cells and T cells, those are all kind of parts of our immune system that sort of float around in the body and just kind of looking. They're kind of the guards that kind of roam around and watch for invaders. And often they'll just, often we don't even know they're at work because they just take care of, viruses and bacteria and fungi and stuff that enters the body. They just take care of that really quickly. We also have the liver, the spleen, the tonsils. Those are also really important part of our immune system as well. But then we also find CB2 receptors in the central nervous system, right, where we find the highest concentration of CB1 receptors, but we also find CB2 receptors in there as well. And then we have the enteric nervous system. Now, the enteric nervous system, some people call, kind of nickname the second brain. So that's the nervous system that we have in our gut. Some people say that it's the enteric nervous system that gives us our sort of that gut feeling. It's even part of our language. You have that gut feeling. Or if you ever get sort of an emotional blow, some people actually get nauseated from getting bad news. That is hitting directly on our enteric nervous system. So that's that area of the body that, lets you know if you're walking down the street alone at night, whether you're safe or not, right? If we listen to, everyone's heard, like, you got to listen to your gut feelings because it never lies to you. So that's a really important part of our immune system, even though we might not think of it as our part of our immunity. But it really is kind of picking up on those signals that our brain is not able to pick up on, and sometimes our brain has a hard time understanding what's going on. Well, our enteric nervous system is saying like danger, danger, and then our brain is going like, I don't get what's going on. So it's another fascinating area of physiology to go study if that interests you at all. Okay, so that was our receptors. So let's look at the second component of our endocannabinoid system, which is the endocannabinoids themselves. So endo is short for endogenous, and endogenous just means of the body. So it was created within the body. It's a very natural process that the body goes through. Endogenous substances will react with the endocannabinoid system. So these are the endocannabinoids. We can define them as endogenous substances, so substances created within the body that interact with our endocannabinoid system. And we've already given 2 examples of that in an earlier lecture, and that was AEA, or anandamide. AEA is short for anandamide, or 2-AG, 2-arachidonoglycerol, which is our second kind of major endocannabinoid that we have discovered. Now there are more that have been discovered, but right now we know that they're an important or unique type of neurotransmitter. We talked about these 2 that we've studied, and then if you like chemistry, you can see kind of the chemical diagram of what those 2 molecules look like. You can see they're quite similar, especially on the one side, and then they kind of deviate on the other side. So if you like chemistry, there's our endogenous cannabinoids that our body creates. I've actually seen some of the anandamide. I've seen that one made into a pendant. Someone has created it with some wire, recreated that, and it made quite a lovely pendant. So that's our endocannabinoids. We know that there are more than just AEA and 2-AG, but again, those are the 2 that have been studied the most so far, but we can see that there's a few other ones out there, and there's probably a whole lot more that we haven't really discovered, or maybe we've kind of got hints that they're there, but we haven't really understood or even named them yet. But you can see in this diagram, we have the endocannabinoid backbone structure, so that's part of the chemistry of it. They all have that similar background, and then we have the one end that will vary depending on what that cannabinoid is. So how are these cannabinoids created in the body? Because our body creates them. They're created from arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid is a pathway of our omega-6 fatty acid pathway. So this, if you study nutrition at all, you're going to learn about the omega-6 fatty acid pathway. It's the way that our body manages fatty acids or that come into the body. So the way our body manages dietary fats. We only have to eat, there's only a few essential fats that we have to eat, and then our body can create all of the other fatty acids that the body needs for its day-to-day physiology or day-to-day functioning. We can create those all from just a few fats that we eat through the dietary system. And arachidonic acid is one of those byproducts when our dietary fat goes through the omega-6 fatty acid pathway. So they are created on demand. These endocannabinoids are created on demand, and they're created quite quickly. It's not under any kind of conscious control at this point that we know of, but they're created on demand at the postsynaptic terminal. So that is where we talked about retrograde signaling earlier. Most signals that happen in the body start in the presynaptic terminal, and then they get pushed over, or they kind of jump that synapse or that gap in between the neurons over to the postsynaptic terminal. What's happening with the cannabinoid system, it kind of works the opposite. So it actually starts, or the signal or the demand is created in the postsynaptic terminal, and that signal gets pushed into the presynaptic terminal and says, hey, we need you to do something. So it's a little bit different than the way our regular neurotransmitter things happen. We don't quite understand why yet, but it's interesting to note, and we will probably discover why and how important that is in the future. But right now it's still a bit of a mystery, but just know that that is called retrograde signaling, where it goes in the opposite direction than what we're used to physiologically. Okay, so let's look a little bit deeper into both of these endocannabinoids, AEA, anandamide, and 2-AG. Just a little bit deeper dive into them. Really long chemical name on AEA. Anandamide is a much nicer name, or AEA is an easier way to say it. Anandamide, if we remember from a previous lecture, we talked about anandamide as being named after the Sanskrit word for bliss. So we call that the bliss molecule. So the actual chemical name is arachidonyl ethanolamine. So really long name, so much easier to just say anandamide. This is produced from the N-arachidonyl phosphatidylethanol, or NAPE, in several different pathways. So we talked earlier about being in that omega-6 essential acid pathway. This happens in that pathway plus a few others. It's a partial agonist of CB1 receptors. So what does that mean? As an agonist, it means that it actually blocks, rather than directly interacting with that receptor, it actually blocks anything from working with that receptor. So when we say it's a partial agonist, is it can partially block a receptor from being triggered. But it is a full receptor against another receptor, which is called the vanilloid receptor, or VR1. Again, you don't really need to know all the big details of how this works, but it's just good to know that how it works. So anandamide isn't always directly interacting with those receptors, or the CB1 receptor or CB2 receptors. Sometimes it's actually blocking them or partially blocking them, and sometimes it's hitting on the vanilloid receptors as well. So there's some crossover with these cannabinoids within the body. And again, we don't really understand what's going on with this stuff. So our next endocannabinoid, 2-AG, or 2-arachidonyl glycerol, it's also produced from N-arachidonyl phosphatidylethanol, so NAPD, and then that NAPE. So primary ligand for the CB2 receptor. So what a ligand is you can think of it as like an escort. It's usually some sort of a protein that is required as an escort to get things into a receptor. So it's a primary ligand for the CB2 receptor. So it kind of can hit the receptor itself, but it can also escort other things to hit that receptor, just kind of like an introduction. Say, hey, it's okay to let this chemical in through that receptor because I'm with it, so I'm going to vouch for it, if we want to kind of look at it that way. It's also an agonist against the CB1 receptor. So an agonist, again, we talked about that just a little bit earlier, where an agonist means it doesn't directly interact with it, but it kind of blocks it or stops it from doing anything. So it works in a couple of different ways. Again, this one is formed in that omega-6 fatty acid pathway using arachidonic acid, which is created from the omega-6 pathway, as well as glycerol. And glycerol is also created within the body as well. Some of these chemicals, the building blocks for them actually come from our diet. That's why diet is so important to our health and well-being. This molecule is degraded by 3 hydrolytic enzymes, the MGL, the ABHD6, and the ABHD12. So those are some enzymes that will degrade it. Some will degrade it right away. Some will let it linger a little bit longer. And the important thing about these enzymes is not that you memorize the names of them or anything like that. But the important thing to know is that these enzymes can be a target for drugs to help with either degrading some of these enzymes so they don't keep that phytocannabinoid or that endocannabinoid in the body as long, but they can also be able to, like, we can target those enzymes to allow those endocannabinoids to linger a little bit longer and have a more profound effect upon the body. So here's just a quick look at what happens with those enzymes. So the FAAH, or the fatty acid amide hydrolase, degrades AEA. So that degrades it just means that it breaks it down into its components, and those components can get recycled by the body. Anything that inhibits that enzyme, so inhibits the FAAH, that allows the anandamide to linger longer in the body, right? So this is an area targeted for development of therapeutic drugs, especially in the treatment of pain, inflammation, and sleep disorders. And we're starting to understand that even some of our over-the-counter pain relievers, like acetamide, those kind of things, that's what they do, is they allow these enzymes just to linger a little bit longer in the body and provide better pain relief for the body. The enzymes for 2-AG, or 2-arachidonoglycerol, degraded by monoacetylglycerol lipase, or MGL, much easier way to say it. And again, you can see in this diagram here is that we have the arachidonic acid and the glycerol. So when our 2-AG is degraded, it's degraded back into its building blocks, which is that glycerol and arachidonic acid. And then those supposedly get either thrown off by the body through one of the eliminatory systems that we have, or they could just be recycled and used again. So that was a very brief but kind of a deep dive into the endocannabinoid system, some of the components of the endocannabinoid system. We'll look at more into the functioning of the endocannabinoid system in another lecture. But again, there was a lot of medical terms in there, so remember to look back at the glossary if you need to refer back to those. And yeah, if that interests you, study up on your biology as well. It's a pretty fascinating system.